Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay, President of the Board of Directors of the City Club. During the 2011 Arab Spring, Syrian opposition began a series of demonstrations demanding the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad. The world was shocked as President Assad sent tanks and security forces to open fire on demonstrators. Since then, the Syrian government has continued its brutal assault on opposition forces, demonstrators, and civilians alike. Most alarming are the reports of torture and mass execution of civilians, including women and children, for which the government denies any involvement. And now there's evidence that Russia is supplying helicopters to the regime of al-Assad. Today's speaker, U.S. Ambassador to Syria Robert Ford, has been an outspoken supporter of opposition forces and has been vocal in speaking out against inhumane actions of the government. A piece in the Washington Post entitled, quote, "Robert Ford Making a Difference in Syria," unquote, said of Ambassador Ford, quote, "He is an example of the free-form diplomacy the United States will need," unquote. The piece noted that Ambassador Ford met with Syrian opposition around the country, quote, "risking his neck and in the process infuriating the regime of President Bashar al-Assad," unquote. In Syria, Ambassador Ford has met with protesters despite many security and safety risks. Although presented with roses by protesters in the city of Hama, his convoy was attacked by pro-government mobs with concrete blocks and iron bars en route to a meeting with an opposition leader in Damascus. Ambassador Ford grew up in Denver, Colorado, and received his bachelor's degree and master's from Johns Hopkins. He served in the Peace Corps for several years and entered the Foreign Service in 1985. Ambassador Ford served as political counselor and registry chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and he worked closely with Iraqi authorities to establish the transition government, write a new constitution, and establish national elections. He also served as ambassador to Algeria, and in January of 2011, he became ambassador to Syria. The Huffington Post has praised Ambassador Ford for, quote, "having distinguished himself for his willingness to take personal risks as well as to deliver candid messages directly to the public," unquote. Ambassador Ford has recognized Facebook and Twitter as crucial tools of opposition movements in Arab countries where censorship and government-controlled media suppress political speech. He's been described by the New York Times as an, quote, "exemplary and courageous diplomat," unquote. Please welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, Ambassador Robert Ford.
Thank you, Hugh. Thanks. Good afternoon. That was the highlight of today's program, and I would thank you all for coming. Jim, thank you very much. It was very nice to meet you today. And Hugh, thank you for that very kind introduction. It's very nice to be in Cleveland. This is my first time in Cleveland, I'm embarrassed to say, and I was really struck on the airplane coming in the airport. What a beautiful waterfront that is. I think of Cleveland as the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. I'm so old, I remember when George Zell was the conductor, and the fabulous performances, several of which I have on CD. And I'm a big baseball fan, and I've seen your baseball stadium many times as the Cleveland Indians smash the Baltimore Orioles time after time. But I'm not bitter about that because this year we're playing above 500. I am late coming to Cleveland, and I will tell you why. It's my fault, but I am late. I cannot describe to you how many people I met in Syria, Syrians, who have family here in Cleveland, Ohio. I don't know why there are so many people who have family from Syria here. I don't understand it, but everyone at the American Embassy, and I met Lila here somewhere, and she's a friend, one of my staff is a good friend of her daughter. We all noticed it at the American Embassy, how many Syrians we met who have a brother, a sister, a daughter, a son, a nephew here in Cleveland. In fact, it got to be where inside the American Embassy, whenever we talked about Cleveland, we would just call it Damascus. We would call it Little Damascus. So I'm late coming to Damascus. I'm late coming to Cleveland. We closed the American embassy in February, I'm sorry to say. We did that because we were getting direct security threats and we could not get the cooperation we needed from the Syrian government to keep it open. So right now, what I am doing in Washington is I direct a team of 8 people at the State Department who work full-time on the Syria crisis. 8 people is a lot. We had only 1 person working full-time on Syria 2 years ago. Now we have 8. So that should give you an indication of how seriously we take the crisis in Syria. What are they doing? What is the team doing? First, I should say, what is it we want? What has President Obama, what has Secretary Clinton outlined for us as our objectives? It's actually fairly simple. There are 4 things that we want. We want, first of all, and immediately, an end to the violence. We want an end to the violence. The estimates now that I have seen are up to 15,000 people killed in the last 15 months. 15,000. Almost as shocking is the number of Syrians who have had to leave their homes. This is not a big country. It's 23 million people. The estimates now from the United Nations Refugee Agency that is working in Syria now is 1 million Syrians have had to leave their homes. Can you imagine that? 1 million? We know that there are approximately 80,000 Syrians who have had to flee the country. They're basically in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and some are now going also into Iraq, which should tell you something about how difficult the situation in Syria is. They think that Iraq is safer than Syria. The numbers, by the way, going into Turkey have been surging the last couple of days. I was in Istanbul last week and met with Turkish officials, and they were saying then that up to 500 to 700 new Syrian refugees were crossing the border every day. That's as of last week. So we need an end to the violence on all sides. Second, and President Obama raised this in great detail with fellow presidents that were at the G20 meeting, including Chinese President, Russian President Putin, and others. We want a political transition to go forward. There has to be political change in Syria. That's obvious to everyone, I think. There needs to be a political transition. Peaceful political transition we would wish. The third thing we want, and the President has spoken very forcefully about this, Secretary Clinton has spoken very forcefully about this, President Bashar al-Assad has lost his legitimacy long ago, and he should step down. The political transition that I just talked about, the political change, must include the departure of President Assad, and not just him, frankly, but his entire family that run the country, frankly, like a small mafia. I'm happy to talk about that in detail if there are questions. And number 4, to replace him in this political transition, we would like to see a representative government that respects the human rights and the rule of law. And when I say human rights, I mean the human rights of all of the different communities in Syria. Syria has a marvelous collection of ethnic groups, different religious groups, an incredibly rich culture, There's still people who speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus himself. There are villages that still use that language. It's unique. So it needs a government that's representative and where all communities are going to feel safe. I think it would be a fair question, especially to people who are watching Syria. What are we doing? What is the United States doing? So I want to just briefly outline some of the high points, and then if there are questions, I'm happy to talk about it in detail. First, I mentioned this terrible humanitarian tragedy, the people who've had to leave their homes, the people who've had to flee Since the start of the year, the United States has provided, and I should thank Cleveland and other American taxpayers for their generosity. We have provided $53 million in humanitarian relief. This is everything from medical supplies to blankets to food, emergency food. It is going into Syria, to places like Homs, Damascus, Aleppo, Dara. It is being delivered by the International Committee of the Red Cross. We don't have any American officials in Syria now. It is being delivered by the Red Cross and also by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society, which is the partner of the Red Cross in Syria. In addition, some of it is being delivered by United Nations agencies, and they are doing very brave and very good work. I want to highlight in particular the work done by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, by the World Food Program, and by the International Organization of Migration. All of these agencies, with the Red Cross and with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, have relief workers, have assistance people on the ground right in the middle of where there is fighting, and they are incredibly brave people. Well, some of the American money, in addition, the $53 million I mentioned, a portion of it is used to help the refugee populations I mentioned in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. Not so much into Turkey. The Turkish government and the Turkish Red Crescent have largely been self-sufficient. Only recently did they ask for international help. Most of our help has gone to the Syrian refugee populations in Lebanon and Jordan. So that's one thing we're doing, humanitarian. Second thing we are doing, I mentioned that Bashar must go. There needs to be a political transition. So we are trying to convince the Syrian government, trying to convince the Syrian regime that they must allow a transition to go forward. So we have implemented, under the Obama administration, in the last year and a half, one of the toughest sanction regimes that we have in place against any country. It is as tough as the sanctions we have against Iran. In some places, it is even tougher. For example, we have stopped the purchase of Syrian oil. The United States used to buy Syrian oil. We have stopped, and more importantly, we have convinced European countries that bought most of the Syrian oil exported to stop buying. So Italy stopped, Germany stopped, Spain stopped, because frankly we urged them to do so. That has had an immediate impact on the Syrian government's budget. It has cut the Syrian government's budget revenues by about 1/3. We want it to be more difficult for the Syrian government to buy the bullets. We want it to be more difficult for the Syrian government to buy the helicopters that it is using to repress its own people. We have put very tough sanctions against the Syrian central bank. We've banned, not only have we frozen its assets in the United States and convinced European countries to do the same thing, but we, the United States, have now banned any transaction with the Syrian central bank, which makes it almost impossible for the Syrian government to conduct many international trade transactions, and we are now discussing this with the Europeans to get them to do the same thing. We have also a long list of senior individuals in the Syrian regime, both military and security officials, as well as business people, about whom we have direct evidence of implication in human rights abuses. So the second thing we're doing is a whole series of sanctions. The third thing we are doing, Secretary Clinton has talked about this several times, we are providing assistance to local coordination communities in Syria. These are the people that are sending out YouTube videos, for example, of what's happening in places like Homs, what's happening in Dara, what's happening in suburban Damascus. The Syrian government has made a very concerted effort to shut down access to the internet, access to satellite communications from these groups. We have been getting equipment into them to make sure that they stay connected. Hafiz al-Assad, when he destroyed Hama in 1982, shut down communications so that the world in 1982 did not see what happened in Hama. We do not want the same thing to happen in 2012, and we will help make sure that the story of the regime's brutalities gets out. And so we are sending in communications equipment to make sure that happens. We also provide assistance to the local revolution councils in some cities. It is always, I want to underline this, it is always non-lethal equipment. We are not sending arms. It is non-lethal equipment, and we do not supply it to armed groups. We provide it to political groups. So that's what we're doing ourselves, we, the United States. Humanitarian, pressure, mostly sanctions, and then assistance to the local coordination committees, make sure the story of what's happening in Syria is told. On a multilateral level, that is to say, working with other countries, I mentioned the work we've done to make sure that other countries apply sanctions, but we're doing much more than that. And I think the most visible thing that you will have seen, if you are watching events in Syria, is you will have heard about the initiative at the United Nations spearheaded by Kofi Annan and the United Nations Observer Team. We have supported that very strongly inside the Security Council. I have to be honest with you that it is not going well. Annan had 6 conditions which the Syrian government said it would accept. Those conditions included withdrawing military units from cities, stopping the use of heavy weaponry such as tanks and artillery against civilian areas, civilian districts, releasing political prisoners. There are somewhere, we don't know exactly how many, but the estimates are somewhere between 30 and 50,000 political prisoners in Syria right now. The Syrian government agreed to allow all press in and to allow peaceful demonstrations. That was what we, the United States, supported. I have to tell you, the Syrian government has not met any of those conditions, despite its commitment to do so. It has not released all of the political prisoners. It has released a few hundred. At the same time, it has arrested many more, so that I don't think the political prisoner population has dropped at all. The shelling of places like Homs that you have seen over the last week, now using tanks against parts of suburban Damascus, including Jobar, Barzeh, and Duma in the last week, show that he has not met the requirement to stop using heavy weaponry. Some journalists have gotten in, and there's been some good reporting from some people like Liz Dorset of the BBC, but many other journalists have been refused visas. And in terms of allowing peaceful demonstrations, there are about 60 to 100 demonstrations a day in Syria still, 60 to 100 peaceful demonstrations per day. Anytime they come near Syrian authorities, they are shot at. I want to say here, and I know this is important for a number of people in the Christian community with either here or with ties in the United States, there is violence on both sides. But we need to make sure we understand that the preponderance of violence, the overwhelming preponderance of violence, is coming from the government. The opposition does not have artillery shelling apartment buildings. The opposition does not have tanks shelling homes. The opposition does not have helicopters firing rockets into civilian areas. There is violence on both sides, but the vast majority of the violence is coming from the Syrian government. And that is why the United Nations, Kofi Annan, the United Nations Human Rights Investigatory Commission set up last year, and other bodies in the United Nations have placed the preponderance of blame for the problem on the Syrian government. Let me just take 2 minutes, and then what's more boring than listening to me drone on? I can't imagine. What's next? What's next? Secretary Rice and also our ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, have both given us an outline of how we expect American policy to go forward. We hope in the coming days that the Russians and other friends of Syria will use their influence to convince the Syrian government to respect those conditions of Kofi Annan that I laid out, withdrawing military forces, stopping the use of heavy weapons, allowing peaceful demonstrations, releasing political prisoners, etc. We hope they will. But time is short, and our patience is not infinite. If the Syrian government continues to disregard its commitments and its obligations, then we will look at another United Nations Security Council resolution with Chapter 7 sanctions. And I can tell you we are actually working on that now with friends in the Security Council. We haven't presented it yet, but we're working on a draft. If it is vetoed, and the Russians and the Chinese have vetoed twice before, as Susan Rice said, we will look to take additional measures outside the framework of the United Nations. We hope that is not necessary. Let me conclude there. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of questions. But again, Jim, thank you for this invitation. Hugh, thank you. I can only say I don't see an easy solution to the Syrian crisis. I can't tell you there's a fast solution. If there was, we would have implemented it a long time ago. It's going to take sustained pressure, diplomatic, economic, and frankly, moral outrage around the world to convince this regime to stop fighting. So thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a special forum featuring Ambassador Robert Ford, United States Ambassador to Syria. We will return to Ambassador Ford in a moment for the traditional City Club question and answer period. Please formulate your questions now and remember to keep them brief. We welcome all of you here and those listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We'd like to welcome guests today at tables hosted by CARE Ohio, Porter Wright, and the George Group. Thank you for your support. This program is also presented in partnership with the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. Now we'd like to return to Ambassador Ford for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone. Holding the microphone today is City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Do you have any greater clarity as to the nature of the opposition in Syria? And secondly, do you foresee war crimes trials in The Hague after this episode is concluded?
The opposition inside Syria is very diverse. The people I met were both business people, but also students, blue-collar workers. It's a very diverse group. People from all communities, Sunni Muslims, but also Alawis, Christians. It's a very diverse group. One of the most prominent figures in the opposition is actually a Syrian actress, an Alawi, named Fadwa Sleiman, a very brave actress who, I mean, her face was known throughout Syria, and she was encouraging peaceful protests in places like Homs and Hama and even Damascus last year. One of the most vocal critics of the regime that has been working from the opposition from the beginning is a very brave woman named Razan Zaytouneh, who's she's a lawyer, maybe 30 years old. When I met her, I thought I was actually talking to a graduate student. I was waiting for the real Razan Zaytouneh to come in the room. A huge enthusiasm, especially among Syrian young people, for change and for greater liberties and to get this awful Syrian security apparatus boot off their necks. With respect to war crimes, I didn't mention this in my remarks, so I appreciate your asking. The United States Department of State recently, in fact 2 weeks ago, signed an agreement with a non-government organization called IREX to set up a center to begin training Syrian lawyers and Syrian investigators in how to build cases that could be used in war crime trials or crimes against humanity trials. I mean, we wouldn't do that ourselves, but I think Syrians are perfectly capable of learning how to do that and building those dossiers themselves. I can't say if there will be or won't be, but I can tell you that the United States government believes that people should be held accountable.
I want to, over to the other side of the room, I wanted to follow up on the first question. I'd like to know in a little more depth what kind of interactions you and the embassy had with opposition people in Syria. What were their primary demands other than getting out from underneath the oppressive regime? And there's been a lot of criticism that it's not a coalesced, unified group. Can you talk about that kind of issue? I mean, it's got to be a lot of diversity in it, obviously, but how has it coalesced, or is it coalescing, and what do you see the future being as a political movement from?
Yeah. Okay. First, in terms of our interactions with them, we, from the first day that I got there, we already had embassy officers from the political section talking to people in the opposition. It was often difficult for those people because they would get arrested sometimes just for the mere fact that they met American diplomats. They were incredibly brave, very dedicated people. As I said, mostly young, but not all. People like the lawyer Riyadh Saif, who signed a document 10 years ago almost, called the Damascus Declaration, which was in 2005, which was a demand for respect of basic human rights. Dr. Riyadh would be now probably about 60, 62. And the main message we had to them throughout was, we agree that human rights should be respected in Syria. We urge peaceful protest, not using violence. We respect people's demand to protest, but we respect the peaceful protests, not using violence. And I'll be frank, I came under a fair amount of criticism even from people in the United States for not advocating violence. There were certain people in the think tank community in Washington who thought we were too soft on the Syrian government, but we did not want violence. And I will go so far as to say, early on, I urged Syrian officials not to use the violence they were using because it would trigger counter-violence and eventually terrorism. I remember delivering that message to the foreign minister of Syria in April 2011. And look at where we are now. So it's just very sad. It's very tragic. With respect to the Syrian opposition, it is a very diverse group. It is a very diverse group. I was in Istanbul last week, and I was in Bulgaria, 2 weeks ago, for meetings with Syrian opposition people, and it is coalescing. It has coalesced slowly, very gradually. We now have a variety of groups that are meeting and are working on a kind of a common political program, and this includes the Syrian National Council, which I think is the most famous of the Syrian opposition groups, and one which we have said is a legitimate representative of the Syrian opposition, but it also now includes Kurds from northeastern Syria. They have been going to meetings, and they have signed kind of a vision statement with other opposition groups. It now includes several blocks, if I can call them that, of tribal leaders from around Syria, in particular from northern and eastern Syria. It includes Christians, Michel Kilo and the Democratic Platform. Michel is a very brave man. He's a writer. He's a thinker. Has been in jail many times. The Syrian government released him about 8 years ago, and he fled, now lives in France. It includes economists, Arif Dalil, and others. So it is coming together. There is a committee right now in Cairo drafting a political program that we hope will include a very broad group Syrian oppositionists, and I think it will. The people that I just mentioned are all involved in that effort. And so compared to 6 months ago or even 3 months ago, it's developing more unity in terms of supporting a plan commonly, even if it's not one single political party. I don't think it needs to be one single political party, but they do need to share an agreement on a plan. You know, and here in the United States, in 1775, 1776, we didn't have one common political party, but we had a sense of what we wanted. We had a political program outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Syrians need to have a common political program, I think. So.
My name is Pete Moore. I'm from the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies. Ambassador, I want to ask you a question about the credibility of American foreign policy on this issue. What you've said today and your statement released on the embassy Facebook page is laudatory, your statement about warning Syrian officials about human rights violations. However, taken as a whole of U.S. foreign policy in the region, when Secretary Clinton complains to the Russians for selling weapons to the Syrians, it's ironic that the $53 million in humanitarian aid is exactly the same amount of money the United States has sold the Bahraini government in weapons, which can be compared quite favorably to your accurate statements about the Assad regime being a mob, and also in per capita casualties, the deaths in Bahrain are equal, if not greater than the per capita deaths in Syria. So this inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy, what effect does it have on the credibility of U.S. policy vis-a-vis this particular issue in Syria?
Well, I've served in Bahrain. I've lived there 2.5 years. And I have to tell you in all honesty that there is a real need for reform and change in Bahrain. And the Shia community in Bahrain needs to have greater respect of its rights too and equality of treatment. But there is no comparison between how things were in Bahrain and how things were in Syria. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. About 6 weeks after I got to Syria, so this would be in March of 2011, I went to Palmyra, which is a tourist site out in the desert, ruins from antiquity. And I went to a little restaurant on the main dusty street of the city of Palmyra. It's not a city, it's a town. It's about 20,000 people. And a man came up to me as I was having my hummus and my matabal and my shish kebab and said, "Can I have a picture with you?" I said, I didn't know who he was, and smiled, and he took a picture. And about 2 minutes later, another guy came up to me at my table outside and said, "Can I have your picture?" Smiled. Third guy did it. When the third guy did it, I said, "How do you know who I am?" And he said, "Well, you must be the American ambassador." And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Because there are secret police all around you." Now, I have to tell you, Bahrain is not like that. And the Bahraini government unquestionably has committed human rights violations, unquestionably. For example, the trial of the doctors. And we have complained publicly about that. But the Bahraini government has not used artillery. The Bahraini government has not used tanks. The Bahraini government has not shelled residential areas indiscriminately, as has happened in Syria. Syria is on a whole nother level. The only thing I can compare Syria to, frankly, is Saddam Hussein. And we have not yet seen chemical weapons deployed against Syrian population. But I would actually have to say to you, we are watching that very carefully. So absolutely, the Bahrainis have a lot to do in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, in terms of reform. But I don't think that the Bahraini case and the Syrian case are at all on the same level. So.
Mr. Ambassador, you haven't said much about the religious profile in Syria and how that could affect the outcome of what's going on in the future. And I have two questions related to that, one specific and one more general. And the specific one is, I've read recently that the Christian community, which is a rather substantial one in Syria, is reluctant to oppose the Assad regime because they're anxious that a follow-on government could be led by the Sunnis, the large majority population, and that could have a negative impact on them. And then more broadly, when you said one of the U.S. objectives is to have a representative of government with human rights, and looking what's happened historically in the Arab Spring and other countries, one might think of that as more of a long-term objective versus a short-term objective if there were changes. Could you respond to that? Those questions?
Well, many times when I met Syrian Christians in Syria, I heard the anxieties that you talked about. They're very clear. At the same time, I don't want to make too much about religious distinctions, and I'll tell you why. All Syrians, Christians included, suffered under the regime. I mean, there were Christian political prisoners, Christians who suffered torture, who suffered summary execution, just as others did. It wasn't that Syrian Christians had an immunity from that. I mentioned the brave human rights lawyer and oppositionist Michel Kilo a minute ago. I mean, he was jailed for years, and not with any kind of judicial process. So I think the first thing we need to understand is that all Syrians, Alawis, Christians, Sunnis, Druze, all Syrians suffered under the boot of the Syrian security regime. And the United States, I mean, if you want details, just look at the human rights report that we issued every year about the human rights situation in Syria. That said, the fears that you mentioned do exist. And I met 2 days ago with a senior Syrian Christian community leader in my office in the State Department, and I again heard those anxieties. That said, I also heard from him a desire to see change and transition. And there's an article, in fact, in today's New York Times about a Catholic priest who had lived, he's an Italian guy, I met him when I was in Syria, Father Paolo we called him, who had worked there for almost 30 years, and the Syrian government just threw him out because he was standing up for respect for free speech, respect for peaceful protest. The Christian community has suffered too. It is incumbent on the Syrian opposition, and this is a point I say to them every day. It is incumbent on them to reach out to the people in the different communities in Syria that are nervous about change and reassure them and work with them to figure out what kinds of guarantees, what kinds of statements, what kinds of processes they want in a transition that will make them feel more secure. There are political ways to address the fears that you talk about. The Syrian opposition needs to think about how that can be done. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In Iraq, where I worked 4.5 years, there were a lot of fears. For example, among the Kurdish minority in Iraq, which had suffered terribly under Saddam Hussein. Chemical weapons were used against the Kurds. One of the ways of addressing that was the Kurds had a veto over certain political decisions reached in Baghdad by requiring in the parliament a 2/3 vote, for example, for the president and the prime minister. That gave the Kurds an assurance that they would be safer in the new Iraq. Not saying that that exact methodology must be copied in Syria, but there are political ways to address these concerns, and that is what we would like to see Syrians talking about.
Hi, I'm not sure if this question's redundant, but last Saturday we hosted a couple who live about 10 miles from homes. They're Christian, Syrian Christians. They were talking about a neighbor of theirs in their small Christian town who was held hostage, and his ransom was $25,000 US, which is a huge amount for a family. And I said, what was the charge? And they said he was a traitor. So there are Syrian Christians who are supporting Assad, and whether they're fearful or not, I imagine they're in large numbers. And how do you address that sort of issue where there are people who are living there, these are people in their 50s, 60s, who are supporters of the regime because they're afraid not to be. maybe it's the Sunnis, but they're loyal. And they continue to be loyal because they're afraid not to be loyal.
Obviously, we don't want anyone to be kidnapped. We don't want anyone to be held hostage. It is not only this gentleman or family that you were just talking about. I'm getting messages from my staff in Damascus, or people that used to work for the American Embassy. Kidnappings are rampant throughout the Damascus area now. Sometimes they're politically motivated, sometimes they're pure criminality, because as the security situation degrades, the government's ability to protect the population from even criminals is reduced. And so there's been a lot of kidnappings for a lot of people, not only this Christian that you're talking about, but just all communities are suffering from this problem. So two things I would say. Number one, we have condemned, I have done so myself, do it again. We have condemned excesses committed by the Syrian opposition. Human Rights Watch, for example, about 4 months ago, issued a report that detailed some of the human rights abuses committed by armed opposition groups. And we came out and said, this is accurate and it needs to stop. It does. But it points to a larger problem that many people are suffering in Iraq now. Not only Christians, not only Sunnis, all Syrians are suffering. And to get out of this crisis, we need a political transition. The solution is not more artillery shelling of a residential area. The solution is not holding more people in political prisons where they are tortured, sometimes to death. That's not the way out. The way out is a political process and a political transition that will include the current clique running the country like their own little fiefdom departing. That is the only way out.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Haytham Haddad. I'm a pediatrician here in Cleveland. I happen to be one of these Christians. I am from Stan Diwan in Homs, and my wife is from Hamadiyya in Homs, and we have large, immediate, and extended family who are all displaced as of 9 months ago. And our homes were occupied, and now they're destroyed. Most Syrians agree with you with the characterization of the regime, and we know what they're capable of. But there's another part to the equation, the Free Syrian Army. Michel Kilo, Razan Zitouni, all these civil leaders are very critical of the direction of the uprising now, with the help of the Free Syrian Army. They, in fact, accomplished the ethnic cleansing of Christians in Homs, with 80,000 Christians fleeing the city, some on foot. I know that for a fact. And they occupied our homes, and now they're holding 400 citizens hostage and as human shields and refusing to release them.
Where is that, Haytham?
In Bistan Diwan and Hamadiyya. I know that for a fact, Mr. Ambassador. And they booby-trapped 2 of our historical churches and destroyed them to make them look as if they came down under regime shelling. When there is a question, when there is a will, there is a way. You were able to protect the Kurds in Iraq, but the Christians were not that lucky in Iraq. Are we going to suffer the same fate, Mr. Ambassador?
Haytham, first, what has happened to entire neighborhoods in places like Homs is terrible. It's a tragedy. People who are forced at gunpoint from their homes, whether they are Christian or Sunni or Shia or whatever, doesn't matter. It's a human tragedy. We all understand that. Want to be clear, we don't in any way justify that. We, the United States, want an end to the violence. I'm going to say that again. We want an end to the violence. We don't think now we can get an end to the violence without a political transition. We have to have that. I want to be very clear because I think there is so much fear among some of the communities in Syria that without Syrians coming back together, I am afraid that the conflict could grow even worse. And so it is important for community leaders, instead of polarizing, to find ways to come back together. It is for this reason that in Istanbul last week, I talked to the Syrian opposition people there about the importance of reaching out, for example, to the Christian communities, to Alawi communities, to find ways to build bridges. And I talked about using politics and using political solutions to give confidence to those communities that they would be safe in a new Syria, in the future Syria. And I think that has to be done. In the meantime, people you talked about, the neighborhoods that have been decimated by ethnic cleansing, and there's been a lot of it, especially in Homs, not just Christian neighborhoods, but also some Sunni neighborhoods. We've seen the massacres in places like... not all... What? Yeah. But I think this points back to the need, in a very difficult, violent situation, for people to, number one, remember that Syria is for all Syrians, number one. Number two, all people are afraid, and all people need to be reassured. I have to tell you, this reminds me so much of Iraq. Number three, you need to have a political solution. The Iraqis eventually were able to get a political solution. It is not perfect, but it is better now than it was in 2005 or 2006. We need Syrians to work on that political solution. So I think merely screaming won't help. We need people to come together and to work together, and I know that is difficult. The United States is willing to help, but we need Syrians to come together too.
Ambassador, thank you for being here with us today. I'd like to go back to the issue of credibility and the sectarian conflict. With all due respect, sir, the American diplomats' history in the Middle East is quite miserable. In 2003, within 3 months, Saddam Hussein was toppled. 10 years later, Saddam Hussein has been gone for 10 years. Last Saturday in Baghdad, 26 Shia pilgrims were killed by double suicide bomb attacks. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, American history when it comes to implementing regime changes is really quite miserable. Why is Syria any different? Why? Tell me why we're going to have success in Syria. We already have, the revolution already has undertones of sectarian violence. What is preventing the current conflict in Syria from going into an all-out sectarian war like Lebanon in the 1980s? What concrete solutions are we taking to make sure Syria is the only exception of the long history of failed regime changes when it comes to U.S. diplomacy?
First of all, I reject the premise that regime change is consistently a failure. I think if you look at Tunisia, for example, the Tunisians have had a series of elections, not perfect, but definitely much better than under the Ben Ali regime. And the Tunisians are now building a new government and are building a new state. If you had gone to Tunisia, as I did, when I was ambassador to Algeria, I visited several times, it was an incredibly repressive place. Even though it had a nice middle class, you didn't dare say the word Ben Ali on the street. People were terrified. It's much better today, much better today. Is it easy? Absolutely not. It takes time, it takes an effort, and it takes an effort by a lot of people. It cannot be imposed, and I don't think it can be imposed from the United States. We can help, and we will help. We are trying to help in various countries, but in the end, these societies themselves will, because they interact with the rest of the world. They're on the internet. Have you seen how many young Arabs are on the internet? It's quite amazing. Satellite television is everywhere now. They know what's going on in the rest of the world. And so change is coming to all of these places. It's not being imposed by the United States. We didn't start the revolution in Syria. Frankly, our embassy, we sort of watched what was happening in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia. We didn't know if it was going to come to Syria or not. The first indication was the El Haria demonstration, peaceful demonstration, in Damascus on February 17th. And I sent a report to Washington that night and said, wow, we had a huge demonstration here today, but it was peaceful, but maybe we're going to have something here in Syria. I don't know. And for a long time in Syria, it was peaceful. Let's be honest about it. It was peaceful. Why did it become violent? It became violent because the government was shooting people. It became violent because people were being arrested and tortured. We have to admit that. And people who don't want to admit that didn't see it. I went to Hama, and I'm telling you, I saw tens of thousands of people. I did not see one gun. I did not see one knife. The only thing I ever saw, as I told the foreign minister, was a slingshot. And they didn't know I was coming because for security reasons, we didn't dare tell them. Let's be honest about the source of the violence. That's the first thing. You can't have transition without being honest about the problems. So, but I'm going to go back to what I said before. We want to be helpful, but in the end, Syrians will have to find the solutions to this Syrian crisis. It can't be imposed on the outside, just as Iraqis. It's not perfect. I take your point about the violence. I'm not saying it's perfect, but compared to what it was when I was there, where every day the toll was 80, 90, 100, 200. There was a bomb attack in Hilla, I remember, that killed 400 people. It incinerated an entire restaurant. It's much better now. It's not perfect, but it's better. And I hope it continues to get better.
I'm with the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I've traveled to Syria and been to the ancient cities there that are the oldest cities in the world. The Syrians are among the most civilized people on earth, a great ancient culture of tremendous diversity and sophistication. My question to you is the U.S. policy, which I think is not successful at this point, how much is it driven by geostrategic issues related to China and Russia? The Soviet Union now has ships sailing to Latakia. Are we, as Americans, are we afraid to do what has to be done from a geostrategic perspective? And is Syria going to fall as a pawn in this bigger situation between us and Russia and China? Because I think the Syrian people deserve better. And I think that the bigger players, and when we talk about leadership, we need to talk about the power brokers in the world and their leadership. And are they going to get along? Are they going to destroy another beautiful civilization in the Middle East and pit religions against each other who know better and who should get along and love each other? So my question is to the great powers. Are we going to fail again?
I'm going to go back to what I said before. Syrians are going to solve the Syrian crisis. And if you think, I know you're kind of, I have to tell you, do you think Russia is going to impose a solution? Who's firing the guns? They're Syrians, they're not Russians. There are Russian advisors in Syria, there are a couple hundred, but they're not firing the guns. They're not driving the tanks. They're Syrians. So today a Syrian Air Force pilot defected to Jordan. He made what I think is a very good decision. Syrian military officers, Syrian military personnel, Syrian Mukhabarat intelligence service personnel should understand, there's a question over here about accountability, should understand that they will be accountable. I put something on Facebook the other day. I've been reading a book about Bosnia and how many Serbian military commanders were held accountable at the end of the Bosnian War. And I don't think the Syrians will face a different fate. I think the same thing will happen to them. So we have had very intensive discussions with Russia about Syria. It was the top item on the agenda between President Obama and President Putin. We do not agree on everything yet. But even the Russians agree there must be a political transition. So that's a start. How we get there, I don't think we agree with them yet on that. Syria was also very high on the agenda between President Obama and the Chinese president, Juntao. I think they met day before yesterday. I would estimate conservatively that the Secretary Clinton is talking to the Russian foreign minister about Syria once to twice a week. We have more technical level discussions at my level several times a week. I have frankly never seen us engage the Russians as hard as we are right now. Has it delivered the results we want? No, although the United Nations Humanitarian Assistance Director, a woman named Valerie Amos, she's British, and she works for the United Nations. She's the coordinator for humanitarian assistance. She has told us that she thinks the Russians have put pressure on the Syrian regime to allow access for the humanitarian assistance that I talked about. Not perfect, but in some cases she thinks direct Russian pressure did enable UN personnel and Red Cross, Red Crescent personnel to get relief supplies in. But that's not enough. That is not enough. There needs to be much more. There needs to be a political transition. But I emphasize it is a Syrian process. It cannot be imposed from the outside. We had, I'd be very frank, we had 170,000, I'm going to think of that, 170,000 American soldiers in Iraq. The solution in Iraq came from Iraqis, not from 170,000 American soldiers. It came from Iraqis.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to a special forum featuring Ambassador Robert Ford, United States Ambassador to Syria. Thank you, Ambassador Ford. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.